Hello, I'm Caitlin Horsmon, and I'm really glad to be here to talk a little bit about my work and then about my goals for both my work, but also the culture that surrounds it. I'm going to start talking a little bit about work that I've done in the last few years. The first slide is actually from the Kemper Crossroads. And I make work that is site-responsive sculptures and videos. Sometimes I use different materials, like this is an image of 16 millimeter film installation that I did that was organized around the Missouri River. And this is another iteration of the same material, just made into a video. A lot of my work is also collaborative. This is a still of a collaboration that I did with 13 dancers, a choreographer, a composer, and a string quartet called Blackbird. A lot of my work is also community facing. This is an image from Practical Optics, which is a show that I did that turned Front Space Gallery into a camera obscura. And one of the things that was exciting about that project was the possibility of programming. We had screenings inside the camera obscura, did workshops for the community around concepts related to how optical devices work and the physics of light. This is a piece called Topotopus that I did in Tulsa that was a project that used local experts to learn about a place. So I engaged volunteers to take me on walks around the city. And as a part of that, we made sculptures, collected things that we found on the ground, so trash, and made sculptures. And I also made a sound installation to go with those objects based on my experiences in town. One of the things that we were asked to talk about in our talks was how things get made. This is an image of a crew working on a video project. And one of the things that's true about media projects is that they're expensive to make and hard to collect. And so there are lots of sort of issues around how it is that you might make a video installation or even a documentary project and fund and distribute it. Another part of my practice that I think of as a part of my work as an artist is doing working in artist-run spaces. This is an image of Plug Projects, which is an artist-run space and gallery in the West Bottoms that I was a part of for 6 years. And this next slide with my goals on it shows an image of Stray Cat Film Center, which is a new venture that I'm working on, microcinema, that is right now in the pop-up residency for Charlotte Street Foundation on Broadway and 17th. So some of the things that are goals for me as a maker and also as a person who's pretty steeped in the Kansas City art ecology is really developing a filmmaking and art practice that is self-sustaining, but also developing a collector base and community around time-based video and film work in Kansas City. One of the things that's true in other places where I spend a lot of time is that there is a community of filmmakers and exhibitors that happen even in towns the same size as Kansas City that isn't really happening here. Some of the things that I think would help to support developing that kind of culture around film and video making come from some of our ideas for the future of Stray Cat, like creating low-cost and free educational programs to teach community members how to make films, and creating a community-driven film lab. There are great examples of folks that do this all over the country. Most impressively, Mano Noawari in Brooklyn has been really successful in creating a community-driven film lab, but there are also examples in Columbus and in Oklahoma City, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, of microcinemas and film centers that are able to reach community members and train them into how to make films. One of the things that I think is true is that some of the people who are strongest storytellers have the least access to the technology and expertise that it takes to make a movie. A movie is a big undertaking. It takes a lot of different kinds of skills, and it's really part of what I hope to do in the next 5 years is to really harness the talent that we have in Kansas City that hasn't been valued or recognized in the way that it might be. One of the challenges that the city faces is maintaining alternative cinema spaces. We all know about the demise of the Tivoli cinemas, the loss of the Cinemark on the plaza, and it really is true that in a city of this size, maintaining an alternative film venue isn't very fiscally reasonable. And so what really tends to happen in communities like ours is that there's a nonprofit film center that takes on the role of exhibiting international repertory and experimental cinema. There are certainly places that do it right and places nearby. I don't know if any of you have been to the True False Film Festival, but there's some crazy statistic like 30% of people in Columbia have been to see a film at True False. I can't imagine that it's the case that everybody in Columbia, Missouri is really into documentaries, but it is the case that the festival has been successful in communicating to people how this cultural event enriches the community, and it is quite a happening if you haven't been. One of the things that is hard as a challenge is finding audiences for sometimes unusual experiences. We're all used to going to the movies to be entertained and have a relationship with commercial cinema that is about an expected audience experience. And going to an international film or an experimental film, we don't know necessarily what to expect. So one of the challenges that I think all independent exhibitors come up against is developing audiences for sometimes challenging experiences. The other thing that I think is a challenge is monetizing film and video artwork. It's very hard to, you can hang a painting on the wall in your house. What do you do if you buy video artwork is a totally different question. So figuring out how to create collectors around this more sort of ephemeral work is certainly something I'm interested in. And figuring out also how to get funding for a kind of artwork that is not only hard to collect and exhibit, but also very expensive to make compared to other kinds of artistic expressions. And always, finding funding is tough, and finding funding for experimental and documentary film ventures. I think there are certainly great models out there, the alt-cap model, crowdsourcing, definitely ways to make it happen. But I think collecting a knowledge base around how that's possible is an exciting prospect. And then finally, needs. Again, collectors, investors, donors for film projects, space for non-commercial film exhibition, and studio space for filmmakers. What a filmmaker studio looks like is pretty different than other kinds of art practices, so certainly something to think about. Accounting and legal help and training and affordable insurance for film productions. One of the things that is true of almost every location is there's a requirement for some liability insurance to have a production show up there. And at the moment, there are no insurance companies in Kansas City that offer that kind of insurance on a day-to-day basis for film productions. And then there are a lot of people, and so then a lot of sort of accounting and legal questions that come through film exhibition, and I think especially indie filmmakers struggle with questions around that. My ultimate goal in 5 or 10 years is to find a way to help create a nonprofit international film center in the city. Here on the slide, you can see it's an image of Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago, which is that, and also an example of the kind of programming that people are able to do at such a place. The Hour of Liberation, the decolonization of cinema, to me seems like a very exciting thing to happen anywhere, but it's really only the kind of thing that is possible at something like an international film center where you aren't, selling popcorn for a living, but instead able to really develop programs around questions that are important in culture and important in the moment, in the place that the screenings are happening. So that's about it. We can do Q&A now about any questions you have about my talk.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience to start us off with?
Wow, that was a really fascinating presentation. I've been here a long time, Caitlin, and I have to say my mind is greatly expanded as to your place in the Kansas City art community and your vision for what we could aim for in terms of building a richer, much more empathetic, involved, transformative niche in the ecosystem here for the arts. So I really applaud your expansive view. I remember you were just a filmmaker and doing very interesting and very experimental niche kind of work. And your talent and drive for pushing out and expanding that into the community and projects that are obviously much more interactive, much more community-based, much more involved with reaching others, instead of being just something that somebody's going to consume in a dark room on their own and just have a very brief momentary flash of insight on. It's just laudatory. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, film is such a complicated field right now. It is being dominated by what I've recently started thinking about as the entertainment industrial complex. Where we're just awash in free mindless entertainment. So the idea of your much more radical and subversive approach to this is really fantastic. I just have to say that it's not so much impression as from the beginning of the conversation, but a continuation of the conversation you've clearly been having with the community for quite some time. I love the idea of the straight cat film project or
Film Center, yeah.
Film Center. Is straight cat is in your mind? The kind of film you're trying to promote is kind of a straight cat. It needs to be taken in and nurtured and fed and adopted.
I'm gonna totally steal that. No, I had nothing to do with the name. It's actually named after an art space that was here years and years ago in Kansas City called the Stray Cat. That was kind of this punk space that was, music venue and films, and then sort of unschools. And so the other organizers of Stray Cat picked the name, but I thought it was cute, so I was fine with it. But now I think, no, that's definitely the reason that it's I will say, though, that one of the things, this hidden movement in my work away from just making single channel work is not just about me, it's really about the conversation that's happening in what I would think of as a very expanded notion in nonfiction or documentary cinema, which is where I would place my work in terms of what's the conversation that my work is having with itself or with other people. Hopefully, that's really where it's coming from, and the idea of engagement and empowerment of people to tell their own stories really comes from the thinking and other makers who are working in that tradition. It's not just me on my own.
Okay, other questions? Right here.
Hello there. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
What I'm interested in, I'm an old-time black and white photographer, still in the dark room, but I'm interested in, and as a professor as well, the difference, how did you make a transition? Because I noticed that you have a lot of wonderful machinery and working old-time stuff where I used to do eighth grade. I'm very interested in movement. How do you make the transition between the camera, not camera obscura, but the camera, and the new cell phones?
So it's interesting what happens with technology. So right now my students are really into VHS. Now for those of us who lived through VHS, that is like the worst nightmare we can think of, right? Like going back to VHS. It's never an originating format, nobody ever shot anything on VHS, but it's the aesthetic of their childhood, and so they love it. They want to make things that look like VHS. And I think there's a similar kind of moment happening for film. So for Super 8 and 16 millimeter, my students this semester shot on 16. Because of the advances in scanning, it's a really good originating format for 4K. So we're sort of swinging back around. And in a lot of people's experiences, and a lot of these sort of community-facing places like Mount Melbourne in Brooklyn, which is like the biggest organization that's doing this work, the limitations of chemical filmmaking are great for people who are beginners. And the kind of magic that happens, I mean, it's dumb to say, but it's true. Because you don't know, it's not like your cell phone. When you shoot film, you have no idea what it's gonna look like until it comes back from the lab. And that experience, I think, has now become really valuable to people. So I think there's this kind of turnaround. For me, I really think that format is like project specific. So the 5-channel installation, the film thing that was on the slide, it was kind of an assignment. It was a project about the Missouri River. And so I wanted to use film because of the ability to directly manipulate it. So I just put it in the river to see what would happen. So I think they're all tools that have different uses and different kinds of projects, are better with different tools. In my experience, everybody's, like my colleagues are always like, some historians like, I had my students make movies on their phone. And then they call me and they're like, God, they were so bad. And I mean, there is a sense in which the access to technology does not mean success. And so there is a sense in which learning the skills is still really important. So, and having an extra microphone. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a good answer for that. I like it all. I also have no problem with commercial cinema. Like, I've seen John Wick, so I think it can all exist together, and that there are more parallels than competitors.
Can we switch to your goal slide? And I love these, as Paul was saying, they're expansive goals that cover several people in the filmmaking in our community, Kansas City. So questions about any goals or anything else? Right here.
Well, I think what's really exciting about StoryCat is that it is an opportunity where people are exploring experimental filmmaking and not the traditional commercial entertainment realm. And I think that's something that I noticed, studying photography and filmmaking at KCAI, where having that opportunity to kind of push beyond the frame, being able to work around the space, and having these kind of spaces to motivate someone to not think just of the entertainment industry, but being able to kind of experiment beyond the frame, and being able to utilize different materials and languages and point of view, so that way it better serves these kind of spaces. Because I think oftentimes when I work with students, they're like, I want to go to Hollywood, or I want to go to Pixar, I want to go to Nickelodeon. But I think these spaces are a little bit more intimate and involving, because it really allows us to see a different way of how we are using our phones to then capture these memories or these experiences. But I think here it's an opportunity, especially Kansas City being in the middle, and that, being more vibrant, being more accessible, and also even too, everybody loves Kansas City and wants to shoot here, but I understand the tax break for like trying to get that refunded is not there. So I think having these spaces and having those resources to make it feasible, I think is very important. And I think that's what I really like about the concept of Straight Cat and these goals, because I really feel like there are going to be some students who may not have access to, you know, those equipments or that knowledge or history and understanding. So I think, like, you know, I'm kind of curious for you, are you going out to the community? Are you getting some research about students or peers that are very interested in this concept, and like how we'll continue to refine that and breaking that misconception that this is not also valid? Because I feel like
people want that one way of like pursuing filmmaking, but I'm curious like how you're still breaking those misconceptions.
Yeah, we haven't really started the educational program stuff yet. It's a lot of work, and so I think we have to. There's some back end organizing we need to do before that can happen, and we probably need a permanent space, so it probably won't happen until next year. But one of the things I love about experimental film and documentary film is that in addition to being like a film type, it's also a community of people who are working problems out and are very honest and engaged and kind of open. So for me, having visiting filmmakers come to town has been one of the most valuable things about Stray Cat. And just so everybody knows, Stray Cat is a community cinema space. If you would like to propose a program of films to exhibit at Stray Cat, as long as it fits within our mission, we will work with you to make that happen. So it is a space that is not just us. I mean, you know, you can come watch experimental films with me. But there are lots of people who program lots of different kinds of cinema there. And so we're working to expand the community programmers to really reflect what it is that people feel is missing. So, and it's been really fun to do Stray Cat. And I mean, I do think that the alternatives to the commercial world of cinema are, it's interesting to think about the places that they are prestigious, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, Sundance has an expanded cinema section. True Falls has a bunch of installations that happen there. You know, the Wexner Center just invited just to do this very cool project. They're remaking a project that Chris Marker did in the 60s with 20 filmmakers who they're having it. So it is like the art community, a place where there are all of these people having conversations. And, you know, Stray Cat's not Sundance, obviously. But I do think that, you know, having a space where people who are coming through town can connect us to that conversation that's happening in important other art spaces is really been super rewarding for me.
Can you talk just briefly about your funding? For Stray Cat, your other streams of funding. So you're a professor as well, and then
That is my main source of money. I mean, I write grants and have been really so well supported by the Kansas City art community in my projects, and thanks to Paul and other folks who make that happen. So I get funding that way through the like usual artist ways. I'm a professor. That's the main way that I fund things. Like I said, I sometimes do very infrequently now because I'm also a chair, which is kind of takes a lot of time. But I also do work for other artists who need to have a video made. Sometimes working with cultural institutions in Kansas City. And then for Stray Cat, so Stray Cat is a nonprofit. We got startup funds from Charlotte Street, but otherwise we have a suggested donation-based ticket price. So we get money for people coming into screenings, and we do fundraisers. We will write grants, but we need to be in existence for a year before anyone will take us. So we have a few months left until we can start on that. So
there's a question here and we'll go to Paul.
Hi, Caitlin. Number 2, develop an audience. What are the strategies you see around that? You know, I know a lot of like people who are in filmmaking will go see experimental films, but outside of that circle, it's, you know, like how do you make it more accessible, or some strategies on that? I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I wish I knew, I guess is my answer. I just keep trying. I think the thing that the people who come back most to things that we've done at Stray Cat have a cool experience and like it and tell their friends and bring people back. Also, I think the close touch with people is really important. Like we had a group of filmmakers come from Iowa, there were 6 of them, close your eyes, and there's this projector that plays the film on your face. It's crazy. I'd never heard of anything like it. And I think it's experiences like that that bring people back. So, yeah, I mean, experimental film, the first time I saw experimental films, I was, I like boring things, I guess, but I was interested, but I was not super engaged. And so I do think it just takes some practice to reframe your idea of what going to the movies means. But I don't know, if you have ideas, tell me how to get more people interested in experimental films.
So back to your funding strategy. We do have a pretty well established community of professional FX people, and in the Crossroads, I know there are a number of production houses that do work for the big gorillas out on the West Coast, and so there is a niche here, and a community of grips and lighting technicians and directors and actors, etc., who are anxious for more films that come to Kansas City, and the whole thing that Steph Strepham and the Film Commission are working on. So that base of industry professionals who are making a living in the commercial film, TV, etc. space, it seems to me that there are people there who could be persuaded into investing in these kinds of goals in order to raise the stature of Kansas City as a center for film and community-driven film projects, etc., with the understanding that that is going to help them in their professional goals as well. So have you thought about trying to reach out to that community and really kind of try to convert them into understanding this? It does seem to me they're not all going to get it, but some of them I think would be it's sort of fertile territory. You don't have to explain to them necessarily why this is all good. I think they would sort of get it.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. Yeah, we haven't started a big campaign for that kind of donations yet. We've mostly been relying on individual donations, but it's on our list of many things. Yeah, but that's a great idea, and I think that asking Steph for help with who to talk to is really a good way to start.
Okay, question over here.
Oh, hi, I think I can talk about that.
Well, we tried to pick up that on the video.
Hi, I'm Linda. I was at the groundbreaking for this Joe B that's over on 18th and Vine at a school, and they're rehabbing this 80,000 square feet, and they are planning on having a video making space in there. I'm not sure how well equipped, and I think it'll be a year or 2 years before it's finished, but it'd probably be good to get in. Alan Gray is kind of heading up what's going on in Kansas City. It's these, they have a Joe A in Chicago that's a very happening thing. So it's the craziest thing I ever heard, but anyhow, I guess it's gonna happen here. So you might, ZHOU, these two brothers from, keep an eye on it, but maybe, I don't know, they seem to have endless money. I mean, I don't know, what other artist does this? It's not an artist, it's China, but hell, who cares,
Yeah, that's great.
As long as it's green.
What?
As long as it's green. Who cares where the money comes from?
Money is the thing that keeps us all together.
We have time for one more question. Or we can also, why don't we end actually with our any question is, what can we as community do for you?
Go see weird movies. Propose a film series at Stray Cat. I really do think that that finding some way to have a nonprofit international film center in Kansas City would make a huge in terms of our ability to attract filmmakers, to keep filmmakers here, to sort of be a part of that conversation. And so I'm not exactly sure how to make that happen. I mean, I'm bothering a lot of people at UMKC. It's not going great. But if you have ideas about ways to make that happen or places that it might happen, I think that for me would be the ultimate thing that I would look